It's a real pleasure to be here today. Can I start off by thanking all the other speakers that I've seen today. It's been a really enlightening day for me so far. And I would also compliment the Limerick framework that I got homework as well. But I appreciated it actually, because I'll be honest, I hadn't heard of it up until I got an invite to speak here. So it was really interesting document to read. And I had heard of Healthy Campuses, of course, and within UCD we have a very active movement in that space, but probably didn't appreciate the depth of work that had gone into developing the kind of policies and frameworks around it. So that was really enlightening for me. And what was also really interesting was thinking about it in this kind of context of One Health, and how One Health or not the framework is, and to try and kind of in my own head explore that. And part of me was kind of coming into today and thinking, actually, when I read the framework, there's an awful lot of One Health stuff in there. So I was hesitant a little bit, because it seems like in a way you get it, but perhaps some of the things that I'll talk about over the next 20 minutes or so, and similarly if you can give me a flag of 5 minutes, will maybe just broaden that conversation and enable you to think a little bit broader about what One Health could be or should be, and how it might support healthy campuses, and maybe develop some different ideas as to how you might engage with this. So I was given the direction that people would maybe, and hopefully it's fair to say you've heard the term One Health. I'm guessing it's kind of a topical term that people have heard of. But perhaps understanding what One Health is a slightly different question. So I'm going to start a little bit basic and just kind of delve into what One Health is, what it could be, what it should be, what different people think it should be, and then maybe some of the applications of it in a broader sense, because sometimes it gets a little bit, I think, pigeonholed slightly. So I'd like to start with that first question of what is One Health. And the Irish government, as they do, I suppose, have tried to define it. They define it as something that is recognizing the connection of the health of people to the health of animals and the environment. And when I look at particularly the Limerick framework, it kind of speaks to that quite a lot, where you have the health of people, I suppose, front and centre, and then how that health of people is connected to the environment and to animals to a large extent. And it focuses on things like collaboration and transdisciplinary approaches, and we heard that in the last few talks as being such an important thing, and I'm sure we'd all acknowledge that on a campus-wide basis as well. The quadripartite made up of the WHO, the UN, FAO and WOA have tried to broaden that definition, and they brought together kind of experts in this space a few years ago, and they defined it as an integrated unifying approach that aims to sustainably balance and optimize the health of people, animals and ecosystems. So it's a slight shift in emphasis. And importantly, it recognizes the health of humans, domestic and wild animals, plants and the wider environment are closely linked and interdependent. And that last word is probably a really key one in that definition. So rather than putting humans at the center of this policy, it aims to kind of broaden our concept of what health is, essentially. So when you think of health, perhaps naturally we think of human health. One Health drives us to try and think about human health as being intermingled and dependent on the health of animals and the environment. And similarly, the health of animals is dependent on humans and the environment and so on. And the consequence of kind of layering it in that sense and placing those three pillars of human, animal and environment on the same level means that you start to look at how you determine health, how you manage health, how you think about things like healthy campus in a slightly different way, because it forces you to recognize that human health isn't the be-all and end-all. That actually animal health and environmental health should be considered in a similar way and should be given equal opportunity to flourish alongside human health. And so it creates this kind of an image. This is a ChatGPT generated image, I should say, so if you see cows with 3 heads or something, don't blame me. But I think it encapsulates it quite nice. I made one myself, but it wasn't as good, so I went with the AI version. The idea being that one feeds into the other, but also one is not at the top. And that's really the center of One Health, looking at things in this really holistic way and broadening that conversation beyond almost a kind of a pyramid type structure with humans at the top, but really putting everything on a level playing field. And what it also advocates for is to shift our thoughts slightly, in the sense that what a One Health approach would encourage us to do is, when we're building policy, when we're building strategies about anything, that we should consider humans, animals, and the environment in that policy or that strategy, in whatever you're looking at. And so it almost becomes like a lens through which we view the world. And the argument then leads on to that One Health really acts as the foundation framework for the development of strategy and the development of policy, the development of how we tackle challenges, be them local, national, or international. And so in the context of healthy campuses, a One Health approach would argue that if you're building any framework or any policy or any initiative, if you're taking a One Health approach with that initiative, then you should look at your initiative through that lens of One Health and ask that question of, is this addressing humans, animals, and the environment? It doesn't have to, but it asks you to at least consider that question and to consider, where possible, to integrate humans, animals, and the environment into that strategy, that policy, that initiative, whatever it is you're doing. And that starts to impact then on how you educate. It starts to impact on how you get to campus. It starts to impact on what you consider sustainability to be, for example. And sustainability gets used as a word, as an initiative a lot on campuses. But how you view sustainability, what that actually is, whether it is actually sustainable or not, these are all the kind of questions that a One Health approach asks us to consider. The nuts and bolts of it, though, is how does it actually really impact us? And when I think about One Health, there's two really key things that I think One Health allows you to do. Beyond the idea of just thinking about how it might impact on humans, animals, and the environment, it does two really key things that I think are really important for a healthy campus as well in that context. One is it helps us to avoid unintended consequences. Because what it encourages you to do is to build teams of people from an interdisciplinary and a transdisciplinary background to ask or answer the question, or to develop the policy or the strategy or the initiative by looking at things from different points of view and considering how that policy or that initiative might impact on those aspects of human, animal, and environmental health. And so if you introduce a policy that's maybe focused on humans, you potentially introduce unintended consequences that are in some cases positive, but in a lot of cases maybe negative towards other humans possibly, but also towards environment and or animals. And so a One Health approach really encourages us to think broadly about those initiatives, those policies, and hopefully avoid those unintended consequences that we might otherwise incur. And the other one, of course, is by following that trend of driving towards building teams that are from different backgrounds, different disciplines, that look at things slightly differently, it really drives home the opportunity to learn from others. Because if you, as we all know, if you just sit in a room with the same types of people that look at things in the same way, then you run into the potential for being very tunnel visioned in your approach. I was struck by what Philip said earlier about coming to the vet school in UCD, which of course is where I'm based in UCD, and I'm very familiar with that suicide prevention initiative because the rates of suicide in vets are really high compared to the general population. So it's a really important initiative in our school. But of course I was struck by also the comment that coming into a vet school was such a foreign environment for somebody from health. But of course, in a way, that's crazy, isn't it? Because vets and farmers and those types of people, they are fundamental to the health of people and the environment, as well as animals as well. So those kind of connections really should be fundamental. Just to explore this a little bit, and when I talk about unintended consequences, I'm sure we could all think in our own personal lives about a decision you made or something you did, and it led to something that you didn't intend. Whether it's you asked your child to, or in my case, my teenage child to, clean up after themselves, and it led to a complete blow-up and not talking for 24 hours. Unintended consequence of asking her to put dishes in the dishwasher. But that's on a personal level, right? But in a broader sense, we can expand that out into even government policy, or in a campus sense, initiatives that have positive impact, but also potentially unintended negative consequences as well. And to explore some of those, I'd like to highlight this idea of making decisions that are focused on one piece of the puzzle. In a lot of cases, and I was struck by some of the amazing case studies that are presented here over lunch, really incredible initiatives, some brilliant examples of people working together. But I was also struck by the fact that almost exclusively they were focused on humans, which is brilliant in one sense, but also potentially misses out on opportunities to make them even better. So we do tend to think about campuses as populated with people, but we also potentially forget that campuses are full of animals. This is UCD, for example, where we have a lake full of different wildlife. We have urban and wild foxes wandering around the place. We also have animals. This is a video of a seagull in the same lake here on the left. That seagull was infected by a pathogen that made it really sick, and actually this video was taken about 12 hours before it died. So we have sick and healthy animals, and they really impact, because the way we found this bird was because students reported that that bird wasn't well to us in the vet school. So that was impacting on their kind of enjoyment of campus, let's say, on that day. And it goes as far as even thinking about things like insects and biodiversity. And I'm aware that some aspects of the Limerick framework really do talk about that idea of place and planet. And I'm really struck by that diagram of those three aspects or pillars. But I guess a One Health approach would encourage us to really name environment, plants, ecosystems, animals, and humans, and really name those as important pillars, because the worry would be, even if it's implied that, for example, in the planet, all these things are included, if we don't name them, then potentially they get missed a little bit. I'm also even struck by this beautiful image that's created of healthy campuses. And looking at it through a One Health lens, perhaps it's a little bit human-centric if you look at it from a One Health point of view. That's not necessarily a criticism. That's just an observation and potential for opportunity to consider. The other thing I was thinking about when I was thinking about healthy campuses is, what is a campus? Because to me, a campus is not just UCD Belfield. A campus is anywhere where our students are working, where they're gaining education, where they're doing research. For my PhD student, who actually just submitted her thesis this morning, that's her campus. She works out in the field predominantly, collecting samples and getting to know both domestic, wild and farm animals. And so this idea of unintended consequences, we heard about the dairy industry and some of the bizarre decisions that are made even at a government level that on one hand are trying to boost the agricultural industry, but on the other hand are devastating to our environment. This beautiful video of a baby seal was taken by one of my students a couple of years ago. We work with the Wexford Wildlife Centre where they do seal rescues down in Gorey. If you ever get a chance to visit, it's a beautiful place. A One Health approach would say that because animals are important, the environment is important, and humans are important, from a healthy campus point of view, there's such brilliant learning opportunities to be able to be built into that and connect that environmental piece with animals and with humans. I show this video because it's connecting the fact that seals regularly come to UCD campus. a lot of the time when they're unwell, or in some cases where they've died and post-mortem is being carried out in the vet school. This particular seal was unwell because it was infected with a bacteria that had really high levels of antimicrobial resistance. And so we were struggling to identify an antibiotic that would actually kill that bacteria. So that's a seal that had never had contact with any humans ever, and yet its bacterial infection was highly resistant to a lot of the antibiotics that we would normally use in animals, indicating that its environment is completely polluted with antibiotics. So integrating these kind of things into healthy campuses, because healthy campuses reflect healthy worlds, these are real opportunities, I think, to educate our future workforce and the future people that will shape the world that we want to live in. The other opportunity, of course, is this idea of knowledge transfer. If you're like me, this is probably what your brain looks like half the time. Things popping off every now and then, loads of things going on, and I'm always worried when I talk about One Health and kind of encouraging people to consider One Health, that you kind of sit there and you think, well, hang on a second, this is what my brain is like at the moment. I can't fit anything else into it. And so I was struck by what was mentioned in the last talk, this idea of kind of maybe trying to add things in, but also thinking about pulling back, but also having the same impact. Because what I would say is that a One Health approach doesn't ask you to individually start to learn everything about everything so that you can build those really comprehensive policies or strategies. What it asks you to consider is that you probably are most likely fit in a space that overlaps with an awful lot of other spaces. And Healthy Campuses is such a brilliant example of that, where there are people doing things all over campus where there's huge opportunities for collaboration and that kind of interdisciplinary mingling of minds and thought processes. And I suppose a One Health approach would say that by not being too human-centric, you create that broader opportunity for broader thoughts to come into play, potentially to develop things that are more holistic and more impactful than they would be if they were focused maybe just on animals or just on humans or just on the environment. So when I think of health, or what I encourage people to think about in a One Health context, is when you think of health, don't just think about humans, think about animals as well. So if you're building an initiative, ask that question of how do animals come into play here? Also potentially think of the environment. And suddenly things get very messy again. But recognize that actually it is messy. The world is kind of messy. And all this stuff is messy. The decisions, the initiatives we do are messy in a lot of cases. They're not really, controlled in a lab environment. So we have to kind of embrace that messiness and recognize that this is probably more a reflection of what the world looks like than linear thoughts, linear initiatives that have a linear impact. And by embracing that kind of a thought process, that broader One Health idea, it's asking you to link with people that will fit into that space, draw ideas from other points of view, be open to those ideas, don't sit within your silo, and recognize that there are connections that you can make, but also that your initiatives, your policies have connections to other things and can lead to those ripple effects, those potentially positive consequences in other areas, but also consider and avoid, hopefully, those unintended consequences as well. Because if we're only thinking about the surface, we potentially miss what lies beneath. And they're the things that we really want to try and avoid. So how is it relevant to a healthy campus? Very briefly. I really struggled with this question in one sense, but it struck me that I would love to work with a lot of you in the room to understand and delve into this question a little bit more. My initial thought, perhaps, is that this is an incredible framework. And I think an awful lot of what the One Health approach would say is embedded in this already. But perhaps one could suggest that it's a little bit human-centric. And it maybe doesn't name as strongly that broader approach. Even though I think it's kind of embedded in there, I feel like it needs to be brought to the surface a little bit more to really embed that kind of broader One Health approach. And so within UCD, this is the kind of thing that we're trying to do. And I suppose if people are interested in what I'm saying and want to talk more, we have the One Health Centre in UCD. And some of the things that we're doing cut across education and cut across research, as well as kind of outreach and mechanisms associated with that. And some of the things that we're doing that might be of interest to people very briefly is we're working with Healthy Ireland local authorities and some policymakers in Scotland around the Scottish initiative focused on place to understand how One Health could be integrated better in that. We've established an all-island One Health network. Every university in the country was invited to join the all-island One Health network. And so if you're interested to find out who is your representative on that network, I'd be happy to share that with you. And that's going to be officially launched in the summer. We haven't been given a date yet, but the Taoiseach and First Minister from Northern Ireland have agreed to launch that for us in the summer. And we think that's a really potentially powerful network that could really drive change. And then finally, the One Health Centre in UCD is a collaborating centre of the WHO, which means that we work very closely with WHO Europe particularly, but also WHO Global and the WHO Academy in Lyon. And we're very much involved in helping them to understand how to educate better around One Health and introduce more effective policies that incorporate One Health into them. And then finally, just one other initiative that we're involved in is building tools that enable universities, businesses, government, integrate One Health more effectively into their policies, into their strategies, and into their initiatives. So one thing we've done is built a tool that we call a self-assessment toolkit that essentially allows universities to audit their curricula, to understand how well they integrate One Health into their teaching. And I think there's potential that this kind of a model could be used potentially to assess healthy campus initiatives and understand whether a One Health approach might be helpful or in some cases might not be, and that's fine also. So that's another thing that may be of interest to people. So with that, I'll finish. Thank you for your attention and happy to take questions.